The world for her existed most clearly between the pages of a simple, spiral-bound notebook. It was a safe place, a quiet kingdom where she was the queen. While the rest of the classroom buzzed with the low hum of teenage chatter and the clicking of phone keys hidden under desks, she was lost in her own world. Her pen, a cheap blue ballpoint, moved across the lined paper with a purpose that her voice rarely found. She wrote about the little things she saw, the way the dust motes danced in the slanted afternoon light coming through the window, the tired sigh of the school's old heater, the secret conversations she imagined the classroom plants were having. Her words were fluid and free on the page, painting pictures with a clarity she could never achieve when she opened her mouth. In her notebook, she was eloquent. In her notebook, she was whole, but outside of those pages, she was a ghost. She was the girl who sat in the third row, by the window, always with her head down. Her long hair often fell like a curtain, shielding her face from the room. It wasn't that she didn't have thoughts. On the contrary, her mind was a constant whirlwind of ideas, observations, and sharp, witty comebacks that she never dared to speak. The problem was a frustrating, invisible wall that built up in her throat whenever the spotlight found her. It was a stutter, a tangle of sounds that turned simple sentences into mazes. She could think the word beautiful perfectly, but trying to say it aloud might turn it into beautiful or get stuck on the B sound entirely, leaving her gasping for air like a fish out of water. So she learned to be quiet. It was easier to be thought of as shy than to be seen as struggling. Her English class was both her favorite and her most dreaded place. It was her favorite because the subject was her passion stories, metaphors, the architecture of a good sentence. But it was her most dreaded place because of the man who taught it. The teacher was a force of nature, a man who believed that language was meant to be performed, not just written. He had a loud, booming voice that could fill the entire auditorium, and he paced the front of the classroom like a lion on the prowl. He was old enough to be a grandfather, but he had the energy of a man half his age, often jumping onto desks to act out a scene from Shakespeare or pounding his fist on the wall to emphasize a point in a poem. He prized confidence above all else. He loved the students who could debate him, who could stand up and recite a soliloquy with fiery passion. To him, the written word was just a blueprint. The real magic was in the performance. And in his classroom, she was the worst kind of performer, a non-existent one. He didn't understand her silence. He saw her papers and her thoughtful, beautifully written essays and couldn't reconcile them with the quiet girl in the corner. To him, it wasn't a fear or a speech impediment. It was a choice. He saw it as laziness or worse, arrogance. He'd sometimes call on her, his voice sharp and sudden, cutting through the classroom noise. "You, in the back. What do you think of the protagonist's motivation here?" Her heart would leap into her throat. Her cheeks would flush a deep, burning red. She would open her mouth, but the words would get stuck, a traffic jam of consonants and vowels. A few students would snicker, not out of real malice, but out of the awkwardness of the moment. The teacher would wait, his foot tapping, a look of impatience on his face, before finally sighing and moving on to someone else. "Never mind," he'd say, the disappointment in his voice feeling like a physical blow. Each time it happened, a little piece of her resolve would crumble. She would sink lower in her seat, wishing the floor would just swallow her whole. Then came the day that changed everything. It was a Tuesday, gray and rainy outside, which made the fluorescent lights in the classroom seem even harsher. The teacher strode to the front of the room, a rare, almost predatory smile on his face. He clapped his hands together, the sound making everyone jump. "All right, people, listen up," he announced, his voice echoing off the walls. "It's time again for the school's Power of the Word competition." A wave of excited murmurs went through the class. This was his big event, the one he coached students for and took immense pride in. "For those who are new," he continued, his eyes sweeping across the faces, "this is your chance to shine. You will choose a piece of writing, something that moves you, something that means something to you. It can be your own work or a classic, and you will perform it. You will make us feel it." He started talking about past winners, about the power of a well-delivered speech, the magic of a perfectly recited poem. He was in his element, a showman promoting his greatest show. As he spoke, a tiny, dangerous flicker of hope ignited inside her. This could be it, a small voice whispered in her mind. Asterisk, I could write something. I could read my own words. Maybe if it's my own, if I know it so well. The words will just come out right. Asterisk. She had a dozen pieces in her notebook that she felt were good, really good. She imagined herself standing at the podium, the words flowing from her, not perfectly, maybe, but with enough emotion and truth to make people listen. She imagined the look on his face, the surprise, the respect. It was a tempting, terrifying thought. Just as she was letting herself get lost in this daydream, his eyes, sharp and knowing, landed directly on her. The entire class seemed to hold its breath. He stopped pacing and pointed a finger right at her. This is a chance for some of our quieter minds to finally be heard, he said, his voice dripping with a kind of challenge that felt more like a dare than encouragement. A few heads turned in her direction. She could feel their gazes like tiny pinpricks on her skin. Her face grew hot as she quickly looked down at her desk, her heart hammering against her ribs. His words weren't a gentle nudge. They were a public push onto a stage she wasn't ready for. He had put a target on her back, not to help her, but to force her out of her shell in the most high-stakes way possible. The flicker of hope inside her was instantly snuffed out, replaced by a cold, heavy dread. The announcement was no longer an opportunity. It was a threat. And she knew, with a certainty that settled like a stone in her stomach, that she would not be able to ignore it. The challenge hung in the air long after the bell rang, echoing in her mind as she walked home. It wasn't just a suggestion. It felt like a gauntlet thrown down at her feet. For the rest of the day, she was a ghost in her own life, moving through the hallways and sitting in her other classes, but her mind was stuck back in that English room. A part of her, the part that had been hurt so many times before, screamed at her to just ignore it, to let the deadline pass, to be invisible again. It was the safest option, the one she knew best. But another, newer part of her, a tiny spark that the teacher's cruel challenge had accidentally ignited, refused to be extinguished. It whispered that this was her chance. Not for him, not for the class, but for herself. To finally bridge the massive gap between the girl who wrote with such fire and the girl who couldn't even say her own name without stumbling. That night, for the first time in a long time, she didn't just write in her notebook. She wrote for it. She decided she would enter. She would face the dragon in his own den. The next few days were a blur of secret, frantic energy. She worked on a new poem, pouring all her hopes and fears onto the page. It was a piece about finding your place in a world that is constantly shouting, about the beauty of a quiet voice that is finally brave enough to speak. She poured her heart into every line, crafting each word with care. It felt like the most true and important thing she had ever written. When she wasn't writing, she was practicing. Alone in her room, with the door locked and the music turned up low, she would stand in front of her mirror and try to recite it. At first, it was a disaster. The words that flowed so easily on paper became a mess of stammers and stops. She would get frustrated, tears welling in her eyes, and crumple up her notes. But then she would take a deep breath, smooth out the paper, and try again. She focused on the rhythm of the poem, the beat of the words, trying to let that rhythm carry her over the difficult sounds. Some nights she felt a glimmer of hope. She could get through a whole stanza with only a small stumble. On those nights she allowed herself to believe, just for a moment, that she might actually be able to do it. The day of the in-class preliminaries arrived with a gray, gloomy sky that matched her mood. Her stomach was a tight knot of anxiety from the moment she woke up. She'd barely touched her breakfast, her hands too shaky to hold a fork properly. At school, every noise seemed amplified. The slam of a locker door made her jump. The shrill ring of the bell felt like an alarm warning her of impending doom. In English class, the atmosphere was thick with nervous energy. Some students were confidently joking with each other, while others, like her, sat in tense silence, rehearsing their lines under their breath. The teacher walked around the room, a look of keen excitement on his face. He was like a director before a big show, savoring the pre-performance buzz. He stopped by her desk and she flinched, not looking up. "Ready to finally grace us with your voice?" he asked, his voice a little too loud. She just gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod, her heart pounding against her ribs like a trapped bird. One by one, students went to the front of the room. Some were good, some were forgettable. A boy read a funny piece with great comedic timing. A girl recited a classic poem with a lot of passion. With each performance, the knot in her stomach tightened. It felt like she was walking closer and closer to the edge of a cliff. Then she heard her name. "All right, next up. We have a special treat." The teacher's voice was laced with a sarcasm that only she seemed to fully understand. "Let's hear from our quietest member." A few students snickered and her face burned with shame. She felt every single pair of eyes on her as she pushed her chair back and stood up. The short walk to the front of the classroom felt like the longest journey of her life. The floorboards seemed to creak with every step she took, announcing her approach. She could feel a tremor starting in her hands, so she clasped them tightly behind her back. She reached the small, empty space at the front of the room and turned to face the class. There were so many eyes. All of them were staring, some with curiosity, some with pity, and some with the bored impatience of teenagers forced to watch their classmates perform. She took a deep, shaky breath and tried to remember the rhythm she had practiced. She looked down at her paper, the words blurring slightly through her nervous tears. She opened her mouth to speak. "In a world of noise," she began. The first line came out, a bit shaky, but it was out. A tiny wave of relief washed over her. She could do this. She looked up, trying to connect with the poem's emotion. "I search for a..." That's where it happened. The word single got stuck. It was a brick wall in her throat. She tried, but the sound wouldn't form. Panic began to set in, cold and sharp. She could feel her control slipping away. The classroom was dead silent, and that silence was louder than any noise she had ever heard. It was a heavy, suffocating blanket filled with unspoken judgment. Just as she was trying to force the word out, a sound cut through the tension. It was the teacher letting out a loud, theatrical sigh. "Maya, this is a spoken word competition, not a..." Stalled one. A few students let out nervous giggles. The sound was like a slap in the face. He didn't even give her a chance to recover. He continued, his voice dripping with a condescension that was meant to be helpful but was anything but. "Perhaps you should stick to what you're good at. The page is patient, but an audience is not. Please take your seat. We don't have time for this." He gestured vaguely toward her desk with a dismissive wave of his hand. The finality in his tone was absolute. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a command. He had not just stopped her performance. He had invalidated her effort, her passion, and her very presence in that room. The humiliation was complete. It was a crushing, all-consuming weight that settled on her chest. She felt the hot tears of shame well up in her eyes, and she fought them back with every ounce of strength she had. She would not cry in front of them. She would not give him that satisfaction. She quickly gathered her papers, her hands trembling so badly that she almost dropped them. Without another word, she turned and fled back to her desk, the sound of her own footsteps thundering in her ears. She slumped into her chair, keeping her head down, her hair falling like a curtain to hide her face. She could feel the eyes on her still, a mix of pity and mockery that was even worse than the laughter. The poem, her beautiful, honest poem, now felt like a lie, a foolish dream. She felt utterly broken, her passion weaponized against her, her deepest insecurity used to publicly shame her. In that moment, she believed him. He was right. She should just stick to the page. The world of spoken words was not for her. The bell rang, but she didn't hear it. The sound was there, a sharp clang that cut through the air, but it didn't register in her mind. She was lost in a thick, suffocating fog of shame. The world around her moved in slow motion. Students slammed their lockers and laughed in the hallway, their cheerful noises feeling like they were happening in another country, a world she no longer belonged to. She gathered her things mechanically, her movements stiff and robotic. She kept her head down, her hair a shield against the world, as she navigated the crowded hallways and out the main door. The cool afternoon air hit her face, but it did nothing to clear the heat that still burned in her cheeks. The walk home was a blur of gray pavement and staring feet. She felt like everyone she passed knew what had happened, that they could see the word failure stamped on her forehead when she finally got to her room. She closed the door and leaned against it, letting her backpack slide to the floor with a soft thud. The silence of the room was a welcome relief, but it was quickly filled with the echo of the teacher's voice. "We don't have time for this." The words played over and over in her head, a cruel soundtrack to her misery. Her eyes landed on her notebook, lying open on her desk. It was the source of her hope just that morning, but now it looked like evidence of her foolishness. She walked over to it, her fingers tracing the edge of the page where her poem was written. The words that had once felt so powerful and true now seemed naive and childish. A wave of anger and frustration washed over her. She grabbed the top corner of the page, ready to tear it out, to crumple it into a ball and destroy the reminder of her humiliation. But her hand stopped midair. She couldn't do it. Those words were still a part of her, even if the world had rejected them. With a sigh of defeat, she slammed the notebook shut and pushed it into a drawer. As if hiding it away could also hide the pain, for the next 2 days she became a ghost in her own life. At school, she was more invisible than ever. She perfected the art of being unnoticed, slumping in her seat and avoiding everyone's gaze. In English class, she was a statue. She didn't look up, she didn't take notes, she just stared at a small chip in her desk, her mind completely blank. The teacher didn't call on her again. He had made his point, and he had moved on as if she were just a minor distraction in his grand lesson plan. That was almost the worst part, being so easily forgotten. The humiliation had been a huge, monumental event for her, but for him, it was just another Tuesday. She ate her lunch alone in the library, and when she got home, she would go straight to her room and lie on her bed, staring at the ceiling, feeling the heavy weight of her silence pressing down on her. The thought of writing, of even picking up a pen, felt impossible. The fire inside her had been extinguished, leaving behind nothing but cold. Gray ash on the third day her grandmother came to visit. She was a warm, sturdy woman with kind eyes that seemed to see right through you. She found the girl in her room, lying on the bed, the curtains drawn tight against the afternoon sun. Her grandmother didn't ask what was wrong right away. She just came in and sat on the edge of the bed, placing a warm hand on her granddaughter's leg. "You've been quiet," she said softly, her voice gentle and calm. "More than usual." The girl just shrugged, not trusting her voice to speak. Her grandmother waited, her presence a comforting, patient weight in the room. Finally, she spoke again, not about the girl, but about the past. "You know, my father, your great-grandfather, had a terrible lisp." The girl turned her head to look at her, surprised. She had never heard this before. "Oh, yes," her grandmother continued, a small smile on her face. "He couldn't say his sounds to save his life. They all came out as... and he was a storyteller. The best in our little town. People would gather on their porches on hot summer nights just to hear him talk." The girl couldn't imagine it. A storyteller with a lisp? It sounded like a joke. But wasn't it hard to listen to him? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. Her grandmother shook her head. "At first, maybe. But people didn't go to hear him speak perfectly. They went because his words had weight. He told stories about his life, about the war, about love and loss. He owned his voice, the lisp and all. He never tried to hide it. In fact, sometimes he would even make a joke about it. It made him real. It made him human. People didn't hear the lisp after a while. They just heard him." The story settled in the girl's mind, a small seed being planted in the barren soil of her despair. Her grandmother got up and poured her a glass of water from the pitcher on the dresser. "The problem isn't the sound, my dear," she said, handing her the glass. "The problem is the fear. You're so afraid of how people will hear you that you forget what you have to say." She looked at the closed drawer where the notebook was hidden. "Don't let someone else's impatience silence your story." The world is full of loud, empty voices. A quiet one, full of truth, is more powerful than all of them combined. With that, her grandmother gave her leg another gentle pat and left the room, leaving her alone with her thoughts. The story about her great-grandfather echoed in her mind. He owned his voice. The phrase repeated itself over and over. She had been trying to fix her voice, to hide it, to make it sound like everyone else's, but what if she didn't have to? What if the very thing she was ashamed of could become a part of her strength? A new feeling began to stir inside her, something different from the fragile hope she had felt before. This was not hope. This was determination. It was a quiet, hard, solid feeling in the pit of her stomach. She walked over to the drawer and pulled out her notebook. She opened it to the poem she had written, the one that had caused her so much pain. She read it again, and this time she didn't see the words of a naive girl. She saw the words of a truth-teller. She made a silent vow, right there in the dim light of her room. She would not quit. She would not let him win. But she would not play his game anymore. She would not try to be a perfect, fluent speaker for them. She would return to that stage, but on her own terms. She would not perform for them. She would speak to them. And this time she would have something to say that was so real, so powerful, they would have no choice but to listen. She picked up her pen, turned to a fresh, clean page, and began to write. The story about her great-grandfather echoed in her mind long after her grandmother had gone home. It wasn't just a nice story. It was a key that unlocked a door inside her she didn't even know was there. He owned his voice. The phrase repeated itself, a steady drumbeat in her thoughts. She had spent her entire life trying to disown hers, to hide it, to fix it. She saw it as a broken part of her that needed to be mended before she could ever be taken seriously. But her great-grandfather's lisp wasn't something he mended. It was something he carried. And people didn't just hear the lisp, they heard the man. A new, hard resolve began to form in her chest, a feeling that was stronger and more real than the fragile hope she had felt before. This wasn't about winning a competition anymore. It was about reclaiming a piece of herself that the teacher had tried to snatch away. She walked over to her desk and pulled out the notebook. She flipped to the poem she had written, the one about finding a voice in a noisy world. She read the words, and they felt like they were written by a different person, a younger, more innocent girl who still believed in fairy tales. The poem was good, but it wasn't true. Not anymore. It didn't hold the anger, the shame, or the new, steely determination that now coursed through her veins. With a deep breath, she turned to a fresh, clean page. The cheap blue pen felt heavier in her hand, not just a tool for writing, but a weapon. She started to write, and the words that came out were not gentle or poetic. They were raw, sharp, and brutally honest. She didn't write about the world. She wrote about her world. She wrote about the feeling of being a ghost in her own life, about the cage of silence she had built around herself. She wrote about the teacher not by name, but as a character, a man who boomed like thunder and valued the sound of a voice over the weight of its words. She poured her humiliation onto the page, describing the feeling of all those eyes on her, the snickers that felt like paper cuts, and the final, crushing weight of his dismissal. But the poem didn't end in despair. As she wrote, the anger began to transform into something else, something powerful. The poem shifted from the pain of being silenced to the discovery of a new kind of strength. It was about the difference between being heard and being listened to. It was about finding power not in perfect pronunciation, but in the truth of the message. She worked on it for hours, crossing out lines, rewriting stanzas, the scratching of her pen the only sound in the quiet room. By the time she was done, she was exhausted, but a small fire was burning in her chest. She read the new poem aloud, a title forming in her mind, The Sound of Silence. Her practice changed completely. Before, she had been fighting a war against her own voice, trying to force it into a smooth, fluent shape it was never meant to be. Now she called a truce. She set up her phone to record herself and stood in front of the mirror again. But this time, her goal wasn't perfection. Her goal was truth. She began to read her new poem. See, that they say a voice is a gift, she started, the familiar stumble on the sound making her old self flinch. But this time she didn't stop. She didn't panic. She just let the pause hang in the air. She listened to the recording back. At first, all she could hear was the stutter, the imperfections. But then she forced herself to listen past it. She heard the emotion in her voice. She heard the anger, the pain, and the quiet strength. She started to experiment. She realized the pauses created by her stutter weren't empty spaces. They were opportunities. They were a form of natural punctuation, a way to add weight and emphasis to the words that came after. She could lean into a pause, let the audience sit with a thought for a moment before delivering the next line. She practiced using her breath not just to speak, but to create rhythm and tension. She was no longer trying to be a perfect speaker. She was trying to be a truthful one. Some days were still frustrating. There were times when the words felt completely stuck, and she would slam her fist on the desk in a fit of anger. But she didn't quit. She would just take a walk, clear her head, and come back to it later. She was learning to be patient with herself, something no one had ever taught her to do. As the day of the final school-wide assembly grew closer, her mindset continued to shift. She knew what people would be expecting. They would be expecting the same shy, stuttering girl from the preliminaries. They would be expecting her to fail, or maybe not even show up at all. The teacher would probably be watching with a look of smug satisfaction, ready to say, "I told you so," with his eyes. And she realized she could use that. Their low expectations were a shield. They would underestimate her, and in that underestimation, she would find her element. She wasn't going to walk into that auditorium looking for their approval or their pity. She was going to walk in as a witness, and her poem was her testimony. She stopped thinking about it as a performance. The teacher loved performances, with all their flash and showmanship. She wasn't a performer. She was a writer, and her job was simply to deliver the words. She practiced in front of the mirror, but this time she worked on her posture, her gaze. She practiced looking at her own reflection, not with fear, but with a calm, steady intensity. She imagined the faces in the crowd, the teacher's face. She imagined the silence, the awkwardness. And instead of letting it scare her, she welcomed it. She would fill that silence not with noise, but with meaning. She had a secret weapon, and it was the very thing she had been ashamed of her entire life. Her voice, with all its imperfections, was uniquely hers. And for the first time, she was ready to let the world hear it, stumbles and all. She wasn't just preparing to recite a poem anymore. She was preparing to speak her truth. And in doing so, she was finally, truly finding her voice. The day of the final assembly felt different from any other day at school. The air in the hallways was thick with a special kind of energy, a mix of excitement and boredom that only a school-wide event can create. Students filed into the large auditorium, a sea of young faces talking and laughing, the sound bouncing off the high ceilings and polished wood floors. She found a seat in the back, wanting to observe unseen for as long as possible. On the stage, a single podium stood under a bright, hot spotlight, looking both lonely and powerful. A few teachers were seated in chairs off to the side, and among them was him. He looked relaxed, confident, a proud smile on his face as he watched his finalists prepare. He had no idea what was coming. The assembly began with the usual announcements and a few speeches from the principal. She barely heard any of it. Her heart was beating a steady, calm rhythm in her chest. It wasn't the frantic, panicked drumming of the past. This was different. This was the rhythm of a drum before a battle. She watched the other contestants go up one by one. A boy gave a passionate, dramatic reading of a famous speech. A girl sang a song she had written, her voice clear and beautiful. They were good. They were exactly what the teacher wanted, polished, confident, and easy to listen to. They were performers. And she knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that she was not one of them. She was something else entirely. Then her name was called. A ripple of murmurs and whispers spread through the auditorium like a wave. People remembered. They remembered the girl who had stumbled, the girl who had been silenced. She could feel their eyes on her as she stood up from her seat in the back. The walk to the aisle was long, but her steps were steady. She didn't rush. She didn't hide. She walked down the aisle, her head held high, her eyes fixed on the single spotlight waiting for her on the stage. Each step was a declaration. She was not the same girl who had fled that classroom. She climbed the stairs to the stage, the wood cool under her feet. She saw the teacher's face as she approached the podium. He had a look of pity on his face, mixed with a little bit of, "I told you so." He expected her to fail. He was waiting for it. She reached the podium and placed her small stack of papers on it. Her hands were not trembling. She looked out at the sea of faces, hundreds of them, all staring back at her. For a brief moment, the old fear tried to creep in, a cold snake slithering up her spine. But she crushed it. She took a deep breath, the sound amplified by the microphone, and looked directly past the crowd to the back wall of the auditorium. She wasn't there for them. She was there for the girl in the third row, the one who was too afraid to speak. She was there for her great-grandfather, the storyteller with a lisp. She was there for herself. "They say a voice is a gift," she began. Her stutter was there, plain for everyone to hear. A few people shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The teacher's smile tightened. But she didn't rush. She let the pause hang in the air, a moment of silence that made everyone lean in just a little bit closer. "But what if the gift is wrapped in thorns?" She continued. Her voice was clear and strong, despite the stumbles. She wasn't apologizing for them. She was using them. She delved into her poem, The Sound of Silence. She spoke of the cage of words, of the constant noise of the world that drowns out the quiet ones. She described the feeling of having a mind full of sentences and a mouth that couldn't form them. As she spoke, a strange thing began to happen. The whispers in the audience died down. The fidgeting stopped. The students who had been looking at their phones put them away. A hush began to fall over the room. They were no longer listening to a girl with a stutter. They were listening to her story. She used the pauses created by her speech to let her words land with incredible weight. "He told me," she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper, her eyes finding the teacher in the front row, an audience, "is not patient." A longer pause. The entire auditorium was frozen. But he was wrong. An audience will wait. If you have something worth waiting for. The poem built in power, moving from the pain of her past to the strength she had found. She spoke of the difference between hearing and listening, of the power in a quiet truth. She was no longer just reciting lines. She was living them. Her voice rose and fell, sometimes trembling with emotion, sometimes firm with conviction. The stutter was still there, but it had become part of the music of her speech, a rhythm that was uniquely hers. It was the sound of her struggle, and it made her victory all the more real. The teacher was staring, his face a mask of pure shock. The smug look was gone, replaced by a dawning, horrified realization. He was seeing her for the first time, not as a problem to be fixed or a challenge to be won, but as a person with a powerful story. She reached the final lines of her poem. Her voice was clear and resonant, filling the vast room. "So listen. Not to the street saint stutter, but to the silence between the words. That is where I live. That is where I roar." She held the last word, roar, letting it echo in the perfect, absolute silence of the room. She didn't move. She just stood there, her breathing the only sound into the microphone, looking out at the hundreds of faces that were staring back at her in stunned, awe-filled silence. For 10 long seconds, no one made a sound. It was a complete, deafening quiet. It was the silence she had written about, but this time it wasn't empty. It was full. It was filled with understanding, with respect, with a shared, powerful emotion. The teacher was frozen, his shame visible even from the back row. The entire room was silent, not out of pity or awkwardness, but because they had been truly and deeply moved. They had been silenced by her truth. Then a single person in the back row started to clap. It was one slow, deliberate clap. Then another joined in. Then another. Within moments, the silence was shattered by a roar of applause. It wasn't just polite clapping. It was a thunderous, overwhelming wave of sound. The entire auditorium was on its feet, the cheers and whistles washing over her. She saw students with tears in their eyes. She saw teachers nodding in respect. She had not just spoken. She had connected. She had not just been heard. She had been understood. As she stood there, bathed in the spotlight and the sound of their applause, she felt a quiet peace settle over her. She didn't need a trophy or a medal. The silence that had come before the applause, that was her real prize. In that moment, she knew she would never be a ghost in her own life again. She had found her voice, and it was more powerful than she had ever imagined.